Welcome to Great Minds with Lost&Found, the podcast that connects people and reimagines systems to improve mental health for youth and young adults. I'm your host, Joel Kaskinen. Lost&Found is a comprehensive nonprofit organization that aims to do more to eliminate suicide for youth and young adults in the United States. Now that you know who we are and what we're all about, let's get to the show. All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Great Minds with Lost&Found, the podcast where we connect people and reimagine systems to improve the mental health ecosystem here in the state of South Dakota and the surrounding areas. Just want to give a brief shout out to the University of South Dakota for allowing us to record live today. With that being said, we do have a live audience, so we just ask that you keep your phone on silent and side conversations to a minimum, but that you engage when you feel obliged to. Save questions to the end, and we will answer any questions that you may have. I guess with that, we'll just say thank you to our guest panelists today, and we'll jump right in. So hello and welcome. My name is Joel Kaskinen. I'm the host of the podcast. And with me today, I have Erik, Muckey, the CEO and Executive Director of Lost&Found, and Caleb Weiland, a University of South Dakota student advocate and leader. So let's start with Erik. If you would just introduce yourself.
Well, first, I always have to say, go Yotes. It's good to be back in Vermilion. Thanks for those who are tuning in. Erik Muckey, CEO of Lost&Found. I'm one of the co-founders of Lost&Found. Lost&Found was created 13 years ago by 5 University of South Dakota students who are freshly out of high school. My piece of advice is don't start a nonprofit at 18. It did turn out well in this case, but I've been with Lost&Found as in basically every role, from founding treasurer to moved to vice president, became the chair in 2014. And then I had a chance and fantastic opportunity to serve as the executive director since 2018. Our organization serves from Minneapolis to Spearfish and seemingly everywhere in between. But our really home and place that we started is here at the University of South Dakota. So it's nice to be home, and I'll pass over to Caleb then.
Thanks, Erik. My name's Caleb Weiland. I'm senior at USD this year. Very happy. Go Yotes. I first got introduced to Lost&Found when I was in college here, my freshman year. Been involved heavily in campus advocacy. Then I met Erik when I was student body president, in which we advocated for mental health resources and availability across the state. So glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you. This is actually Caleb's second time on the podcast, the first time live. So thank you so much for being here. And to those of you listening at home or tuning in today in our audience, before we begin, I just want to say that today's conversation is part of a series of live recorded podcasts that we are doing as part of our 30 Days, 30 Stories for National Suicide Prevention Month. Each of these stories and live podcast recordings will feature some panelists sharing their story, a little bit about their story with mental health, as well as how they're connected to the greater community and the work that they're doing. So with that all being said, we're super excited to dive into the conversation. So let's get to it. We already heard a little bit about each of you. So I'm curious now if you'll give a brief synopsis of your own mental health stories and why you're here on the podcast today to talk about advocacy specifically surrounding students.
So I think the biggest thing to start and connect with is that the connection that Caleb and I have is not just related to USD, but also the fact that we were heavily involved in different advocacy work here at USD, albeit in different roles. But I think the one shared role we have is student body president for the University of South Dakota. And I think ultimately, when I think about my own mental health journey, it starts being here in Vermilion. And it kind of takes a pathway of you might expect that your student leaders are really well put together. They are, yeah, Joel's laughing. The high achieving students are the ones who folks look to say they're campus leaders, or the folks who, are doing really well. They have it all, whatever that might look like. And to be really blunt, my worst period of mental health came out of my senior year of college. Coming out of serving as a student body president, but also an honor student. I was involved in probably too many student organizations. And because of all of that time that was focused on professional development and what I could do in terms of impact, it was a really easy way for me to socially isolate. Given my rural background, my background came from a family that was really dedicated to service in the community. That was a really important value. But I don't know that I always knew how to balance that with actually taking care of myself. It was kind of I wouldn't say that self-care was a dirty word so much as it just didn't exist in the vocabulary. And so my worst moment actually came out of undergrad where at the end of my college career, I was severely burnt out, experienced severe depression, was diagnosed with it, went through a decent amount of talk therapy, but actually was considering suicide at the time because of how horribly burnt out I was. And so for me, I've been with Lost and Found since it started. Lost and Found started in 2010. When I started, I was the founding treasurer, and I had no real connection or experience with mental health or suicide. I was just brought on because I was the accounting student, and they thought that would make me a good nonprofit treasurer, which it did. But that's not why I stayed. The most important part of my story is that in that moment, in that place, when Lost and Found was transitioning, the story of Lost and Found follows student advocates, college students who were all finishing up at the University of South Dakota, going their separate ways. My worst moments of mental health were the moments that I was asked to lead Lost and Found. So there's kind of this inextricable tie for me of saying the experience that I went through is ultimately what drove me to stay in the work that I do, because I knew from that experience that somebody who did have access to a really good support network and maybe better than average access to resources in terms of being able to find a mental health professional, especially living in Sioux Falls at the time, that if I didn't have that experience, I don't know where I would be. I probably wouldn't be here. But most importantly, if I was struggling with that, with the privileges of society that I have being a white cisgender Christian male, I can't imagine what it's like to not have the access to help and resources. And so for me, it was kind of a moment in time for me of just kind of an awakening of, I need to stay with this. There's a reason for me to be doing this. And so almost 10 years later, it's led to a pretty awesome journey of growing impact and building an organization that serves 35 communities in the region. So that's where my mental health journey goes, and why I'm here to share a little bit more about my own story, but also maybe most importantly, give people the understanding of that fact that is kind of pesky in a college campus, which is students do have power.
I, like Erik, I'm a retired student body president, very happily retired. If you're wondering, very happily retired. I enjoyed my work as student body president a lot because I met people like Erik, and we actually made an impact on communities across the state. But my mental health journey started when I was really younger, and I didn't even know it. I was involved in a car accident, lost my best friend, and I had no idea how to cope with it. And went to counseling once. The guy said, "You're fine." And I said, "Okay, I'm fine." I dealt with that for years. And then it hit me again when I came to college. I'm from Beersford, so I'm 20 minutes up the road from Vermilion. I, like Erik, like my family is huge on community service. Like if you feel bad, just give to others constantly. And so I tried doing that at USD, applied for SGA my freshman year, got it. And when I was like 4 months into my term, I think 3 or 4 months into my first term on SGA as a senator, I walked into my friend's room and she was overdosed on the floor, and I had no idea what to do. I'm a political science major who knows nothing about medicine, nothing really about mental health at the time. And so I decided, I got to learn more about this. I got to do something about this. This isn't okay. And so with that, I just fueled some energy and some motivation behind me and a group of our peers to find out what we could do about it. A lot of people talk about getting things done, but Erik's the type of guy to actually get them done. And that's what we did last session in Pierre. Had a lot of fun doing it, a lot of stressful times, but a lot of fun doing it. But even after we, had the successes that we had and advocated for what we had to do, there's still a need for it. Like, our suicide rates are still way too high. Our mental health issues for our youth and young adults are unacceptable. And so that's why I'm a proud friend of Lost and Found. That's why I'm proud to help you guys out constantly, because the work you guys do actually has an impact in communities across the state and across the region as well. So.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your stories and sharing with our listeners why the student advocacy piece of this is so important. So let's get into that conversation a little bit, but I think it's important to do so by starting at the beginning. So Erik, will you just start by sharing where Lost and Found has been in the last 10, 12 years and kind of the spark of student advocacy, and maybe from there where you see us going?
So I enjoy the fact that our history starts with Facebook, and I think that might be dating ourselves a little bit. Fortunately, at least it's not dating ourselves all the way into MySpace. So Lost and Found began as the idea of a 16-year-old in Mitchell, South Dakota, who got into a Facebook argument with a young woman named Kayla Ruskowski in, I believe, it was Dearborn, Michigan.
No surprise there.
Yeah. Joel's from Michigan. So this 16-year-old from Mitchell, South Dakota happened to be DJ Smith. DJ and this young woman from Michigan got into an argument about an organization that was really sort of taking off in 2008 called To Write Love in Her Arms. If anybody listening knows the organization well, when we say to write love in her arms, they're literally saying to write the word love on your arm as an awareness tactic. And it really took off in the era of MySpace. Shout out to MySpace. But then it really started to take hold, as were other mental health and suicide prevention programs on social media. And so DJ and Kayla had this idea that they said in their argument, they didn't think that writing love on your arm was enough. You need to do more than that. And so they created a Facebook group literally titled Doing More Than Writing Love on My Arm. And in that group, they decided to pay forward a random acts of kindness, sharing of mental health resources, and getting groups of people to think through how do they reach the 3 closest people in their lives with information that might help them. And I don't know that DJ had any clue necessarily where this was going to lead, so much as DJ was the type of person that when you take a bet to treat somebody well, he's going to do it. And ultimately what he ended up doing was senior year of high school. He and I knew each other because of Family, Career, and Community Leaders of America. Shout out FCCLA. And at the about November, December timeline of his senior year of high school, he was panicking because he had to have an event for his senior year. That was part of sort of the process, I guess, for Mitchell FCCLA. He went to Mitchell High School in South Dakota. And he decided to turn to this newfangled event called Applied Technology. We didn't know what the hell it was. Like I genuinely, I don't know that that's now a SAR event in FCCLA. I think the last time I was at an FCCLA conference, it was not, but it just happened to be, for the purposes of this, a helpful leeway to Lost and Found. He took this idea of a Facebook group, and I thought it was just nonsense. Like, you get to put up a Facebook group as part of a school project. Like, what is this? And he goes to the state conference and he wins top superior in this new event. He takes it to the national conference in Chicago. I joined him for a different event. My event was way less cool, planning for college, going to USD, though it did help. And he won top superior with this project. And we're on the ride home from Chicago on the bus, and this guy has the gall to walk up and he's like, you know what? We're going to start a nonprofit. And for a second, I was just like, okay, DJ, like, slow your roll a little bit. But ultimately, he pulled a group of us on the bus together and said, no, we're actually going to make this happen. His father at the time was, I believe, the state's attorney for Davison County and is now a judge. And he was the one who actually drafted the articles of incorporation and the bylaws and said, okay, great, start this organization. DJ asked me, because he knew that I was the numbers guy, the accounting guy, we'd love for you to be the treasurer. And it was a real honor to serve my friend and help him. But most of us didn't have any real strong connection to mental health other than DJ did. DJ had experiences with his own mental health journey. He had not yet come out as a member of the LGBT community. He went through that process and period in Mitchell where he didn't feel like his full self. He also lost friends in accidents, and I believe he was a suicide loss survivor at one point in high school. All of this to say, this is not a brief history. We'll get there eventually. That this was really the start of the first time in South Dakota history that you saw students actively advocating for suicide prevention resources. 2010, suicide prevention and the topic of it was really new for people to get their minds wrapped around. It was also around the time that suicide was really starting to kind of climb. And what Lost and Found came to was, you have 5 18-year-olds that are finishing high school summer after. How fast is this really going to take off? Well, the way that they took off was that DJ had this new idea. He was full of ideas, to start a student organization on a college campus. And what that turned into is now the first Lost and Found chapter started at the University of South Dakota in 2011, spread to SCSU in 2012 and Dakota State in 2013. And the focus of this whole movement, he literally termed it as a movement, was we have to get people talking about, ironically, awareness was not the only thing we wanted to focus on. He wanted to get people talking about suicide prevention and talking about mental health. And maybe more importantly, what can we actually do to make a difference? What we did in college was, frankly, in my end, wild. We were really focused first and foremost as a organization for suicide loss survivors. And so you had college students serving families who were going through a grieving process in a way that, in hindsight, I part of me thinks, how did we have the audacity to do that? But ultimately, it's what led us to our greatest strengths. Led us to a family who lost a loved one that I actually knew, giving the funds from their son's funeral to start the first advocacy group at South Dakota State University. We ran into folks who led us to, advocacy groups at Dakota State University who were really concerned about, as a student government, how they would support students because they didn't really have access to services at the time. All of that to say that this one kid, the 16-year-old from Mitchell, South Dakota, launched a movement that eventually would become the first groups really advocating for mental health on college campuses in South Dakota, period. And, it just happened to be that we got involved in student government. I think Caleb and I are both glad to be retired from that work at this point. But this man, Dennis Smith, DJ Smith, I can't call him Dennis. It's hard for me to do that. It's weird. But fundamentally, what you have is that at the University of South Dakota, the students here banded together and created the first advocacy in South Dakota for mental health. And most importantly, they actually started winning things, specifically through student government. Getting some of the first updates to sexual assault policies at the Board of Regents level, getting legislators to really understand for the first time back in 2013, 2014, that mental health was actually an issue that they might have to solve for at some point. Getting more of an awareness of the suicide around the region and what that means. And so I think what we saw was that it started with some student organizations, which in the grand scheme of things, the average person might say, great, another student organization. And what's next? What that eventually led to was, over a period of a decade, you can look back and see anywhere between 300 to 400 students approximately in South Dakota who have been involved in a campus chapter, have now got involved in other Lost and Found programs. But there is now this whole new generation of South Dakotans who their first experience of advocacy was through Lost and Found, and the opportunity to say, we can do more to prevent suicide. We can do more to raise awareness of mental health conditions. We can do more specifically to actually solve for a system that hasn't even really been developed yet for mental health. And so my brief history turned into a not brief history, but I think what I would share, and I know that probably Caleb shares this as well, is really the history of student advocacy for mental health in South Dakota starts with Lost and Found, and it starts with DJ Smith and South Dakota Student Federation.
Perfectly said. All right, Caleb, let's hear from you. What is a little bit of your history and experience with mental health, and then also kind of how you got into advocacy as a student, but then more importantly, because you didn't really know mental health at the time, you said, how you kind of started to get involved with mental health advocacy specifically.
Yeah, I took over as a sophomore, student body president, and there were a lot of issues facing us, obviously, like getting the drunk bus back online after COVID. That was probably a big student concern. But I kept getting emails and Instagram DMs and Snapchats from everyone, from a lot of students who wanted to get into the Cookhouse. That's our counseling center here on campus. And they said their wait time was 4 months and 5 months. And yes, USD has a crisis counselor online 24/7, but it's not just one session that would fix everything for them. And so I started having conversations with individuals, one of them being President Gestring, is talking about what can we do as the University of South Dakota Student Government Association and as Student Federation to like fix this problem, or to better address it rather. And she pointed me in the direction of Erik Muckey. And I think within a week or two, we had a plan already to just get the ball rolling for student advocacy. I couldn't, in good conscience, think that I was getting anything done if I didn't give student advocacy a shot when it came to mental health. I interned in the state legislature when I was a freshman. I paged when I was a senior in high school. I still had some pretty decent connections there. I was decently involved in politics at the time. And so I said, if anyone can do it, it's me, which is way too overly ambitious at the time. Like that is, I should have never thought that, but I did. And it worked out in the end. Honestly, we worked with the South Dakota Student Federation. We asked students a bunch of survey questions, which I'm sure they were so happy about, from all the Regental institutions about, do you think we have enough mental health resources? How long have you waited for a counselor on or off campus? Have you used the federal grant funding if you're an in-state student for counseling services? Oh, and also, do you think the campus communities talk enough about mental health and suicide prevention? I said this prior on the previous podcast I was on, but I went into that survey thinking we'll do decent, we'll be okay. And I looked at the results when it was over, and I might have not said some okay words, but what it did is it motivated me to realize that we needed to do more, that the need was far worse than I thought, than the story that was being told across all Regental institutions. Now, look, USD and other campus communities have made great progress when it came to mental health, but I wanted to be a part of the team that did even more. And so the South Dakota Student Federation, I had the privilege of being president of that, and we were at a meeting, and actually at the time I was the SDSU student body president, was talking about how he's hearing the same things and we need to do more. And I just said, that's enough. Let's do a mental health strategic plan. Let's find partners and let's get it done. I had the honor of going to Pier with Erik so many times, and wonderful warm temperatures in Pier in the winter. But in it, the long days turned like good results. I grew a wealth of knowledge when it came to student advocacy. But what I found out that works best when it came to student advocacy is that the students are telling the story, that it's a student initiative, that when we went to the Board of Regents and said, this is our number one issue, they listened. And this is the same thing with the legislature. Erik and his team at Lost&Found did a phenomenal job at writing the story about how their programs work. And I bought into that right away. I drank the Kool-Aid from Lost&Found from day one. But yes. We did it. When we went and told legislators that we wanted to do more, and we presented the research and the data and the stories and testimonies from everyone, it was a no-brainer for them at a certain point when you show them the statistics about how bad suicide is in South Dakota, that you can either be a part of the story of us doing more or you don't have to be. And I'm happy that a majority in each house and the governor said, I want to be a part of that story. So.
Well, I mean, that drives the point home, honestly, that stories are important. That's part of this project that we're working on. And it's part of why both of you got involved, is hearing other people's stories. It's why I'm involved, is I have a story to share. And I know several other people, who are involved in sharing those stories. So let's talk a little bit further about those stories of students. We know that suicide is the leading cause of young people in the state of South Dakota today. So why do you feel that young people today are at such great risk? Let's start with you, Caleb, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I started, my senior year of high school, I was COVID-19 in March, so that got ruined. And then my freshman year at USD was COVID too, all the way through. And I realized there was a cultural shift in individuals embracing isolationism and, being separate all the time and not communicating as well. And so I'd point out that COVID, I think, was a catalyst. I don't think it was the origin story for mental health. I know that it wasn't the origin story for mental health problems in South Dakota, but it was a major catalyst, and we were not prepared for it whatsoever. We, as in the government, was not prepared for it whatsoever. And so when I came to USD, there was not much conversation about mental health. There wasn't. The only thing they said was the cookhouse is if you need to go to counseling, you can just go there. I mean, it's very casual, and I was confused because my whole childhood growing up was, oh, you can have some self-care if you need it and take some time for yourself. But when I looked around and when I listened to people and their stories, there weren't enough resources. People were really struggling, and there wasn't a community around them to support them. And I think I'm going to segue a little bit into this question, but I think the main thing I learned from Lost and Found through the peer-to-peer mentoring program is how much support means to people in need. Meet them where they're at, welcome them where they're at, and be with them where they're at. That is something that I wish we had when I was a freshman at the University of South Dakota during COVID-19, because it can change lives. It can save lives. And that's something that I feel proud to be a part of that story when it comes to the peer-to-peer mentoring program. But that's something that our state, way back when, it wasn't a thing. So thank you, Erik, for that.
Can you, before you pass over the microphone, can you share any common trends that you're seeing among students or on campus or among the communities that you call home?
Yeah, I would say one major thing is coping skills. A lot of people, I read a research article preparing for testimonies in front of the legislature, maybe one too many. And thank you to my professors if you're watching this, for the shout out for letting me miss class. But I would say, in one of those research articles, it showed how the younger generation takes compliments and takes criticism very differently. It's like a compliment sandwich. You're doing great. You need to work on this better, but you're still doing really good. And I realized that hit home for me. I was like, I'm a compliment sandwich guy through and through. And that's, look at the people who gave me good compliment sandwiches. I was like, oh, that motivated me. But when it came to people taking feedback, they didn't know how to do it, and giving and receiving feedback, whether it's constructive criticism or not, or if a student is going through a traumatic or a mental health crisis, they didn't know the resources or the ability that they had in themselves to make it through and pull together. And that's something where I became passionate about that, yet again, through Lost and Found in our legislative advocacy. But throughout South Dakota communities, we have the, get tough mentality of just work harder and it'll all be fine at the end of the day. And I'm a rural farm kid. I mean, a 4th generation cattle producer, but my dad, love him to death, but he's always that type of guy. I mean, he's the old farmer that tells you, oh, you're fine. You just go through at the end of the day. And when I looked around, when we heard stories from K-12 schools, to Board of Regents schools, to Board of Tech Ed schools, and other private institutions in South Dakota, I realized, A, it wasn't an isolated incident. This isn't just happening at one specific university. It's also not happening with a specific age range of 18 to 19. It is every single age range for youth and young adults in South Dakota. And that's when I realized we had to do something more, which is why I was a very big student advocate on this.
Awesome. Well, Erik, let's hear from you now. Common trends in South Dakota that you're noticing. Also, you have that data. And, obviously the first question that I asked was, why do you think the young people are so at risk today?
Well, it's going to be hard to follow up Caleb on this one. I think the big thing that shows up for me is that when you look at the data over the past 10 years, one thing that's important for listeners to know is that suicide wasn't always a leading cause of death for youth and young adults. Now it is. So we went from suicide being the 3rd or 4th leading cause of death to now it's the top thing. When I think about the trends that are contributing to that, what I want people to remember is that suicide impacts everybody, but it disproportionately impacts certain populations. And it's not just a challenge when I see folks talk about, suicide does disproportionately impact Native American communities. It also disproportionately impacts our rural communities. It also disproportionately impacts folks who are coming out of, say, like a high trauma profession. So I'm thinking of we're talking about under the age of 34. when you think about Lost and Found's mission, you're trying to talk about an age demographic from 10 to 34. You're talking about fourth graders to parents. Very broad range where you're talking about professions that are high strain. I was just at the USD Law School today talking about the impact in their profession. You know, in terms of suicide risk for those types of professions, just using attorneys as an example, they're twice as likely to consider suicide compared to the general population. If they don't manage stress, they're 22 times more likely to consider suicide. So numbers are dramatic for those types of professions. It's also really important to tap into the fact that suicide does impact the LGBT community here specifically in a much more disproportionate way. When I think about all of those things and think about trends, common trends in South Dakota, what shows up for me is that one, in this 12-year trend, you're talking about a massive change in how we consume data. You have a larger tendency to choose social media as a point of community over maybe sense of, okay, I'm just connecting to connect kind of thing. I think ultimately what it comes back to, honestly, is we have a system that's not yet been designed for the type of demand that we have for mental health services. Caleb mentioned the generational shift. I think one thing that's really important for us to remember is that when we talk about the mental health ecosystem in South Dakota and frankly, United States, it's not broken. It was never built. And so when you think about the process of saying, you know, we've tried to focus on, hey, we have a higher suicide rate or emerging suicide issues. Okay, emerging mental health conditions. Our first tendency is to say, go to a counseling center. And we should. We need to have those resources. We need to have that profession. I'll sit down until I'm blue in the face and say, USC Counseling Center will always need more counselors. SUSU Counseling Center will always need more counselors. Our state just needs more mental health professionals, period. End of story. At the same time, because we have done such a good job, an effective job of getting out the fact that there is a challenge, there is a problem, more people are aware, more people are seeking care. What happens when you're seeking care and you don't have resources to actually help them? Not great things tend to happen. And I think what we've now learned, and this is a trend that I think Lost and Found, unfortunately, I think is on the front end of, I hope, is that there needs to be more focus on building communities, not just building more resources for mental health professions. You need both. And you can't take a one size fits all or even just a portion of this and say it's going to fix it. You need a comprehensive approach. And I think what we're seeing in South Dakota is more youth and young adults are feeling more isolated, whether geographically or otherwise. And we don't have the systems and the resources for them in very disparate locations. I think what's helpful in places like the Board of Regents system and the Board of Tech Ed system is, relatively speaking, they're resource rich. It doesn't mean they are. But then you go to places like, you know, rural South Dakota, you go to a tribal nation, they may not have access for, you know, dozens, hundreds of miles even. And so what I think is the common trend for us here is, certainly we can talk about a bunch of things that feed in and that, you know, disconnect people, but loneliness, isolation, combined with a system that's not yet prepared to handle the onslaught of demand, especially coming out of the pandemic when people started to see it and feel it so viscerally. That's what is happening. You have something that was already a problem before, as Caleb rightly alluded to, and then you just threw a bunch of gas on it. And now it's not an intractable problem, but for a lot of folks, it probably feels like it is.
I mean, I certainly think that it feels like it is. And I'm someone that's working in this field, knowing that there is a very small amount of people doing the work that we're doing. So let's talk a little bit about that infrastructure and the tools that we do have at our disposal. So what are some of the strategies that hold the most promise for preventing suicide today?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, what's important for folks to remember is that suicide is preventable, even if it is complicated and challenging to deal with. I think in South Dakota, anyway, it'll be a good transition and segue into House Bill 1079, which we both work together actively to push forward. What seems to work well right now is putting folks in profession, making sure that there are clear supports for economic support specifically. So if you were to go today to look at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention strategies for suicide prevention that are known to be effective, rule number one, strengthen economic supports. Might seem really simple, but people having homes and people having a reasonable income makes a big difference. So if there's a clear strategy for that, that's part of it. I think in South Dakota specifically, we're doing a nice job of putting together planning that's actually going to help in the sense of there's a focus on communication and use of language. There's a really big focus and emphasis on making sure that our economic resource centers for the state of South Dakota and for other resources are getting trained and getting resources on suicide prevention. I think the other side that's maybe helpful systemically is we're really thinking about what policies will put peer supports in place that are really critical and known to be effective, that will help us improve our data collection up front so we know about factors that are contributing to suicide, and then ultimately doing something that we haven't done historically, which is put funding towards suicide loss survivor support. But that's probably those are the strategies that are known to be effective and that we're seeing, I guess, the first investments being put into that. And I'm hopeful that that will change things. Obviously, to your point, Joel, got a heck of a long way to go. But I think what has the most promise to prevent suicide in South Dakota right now is the fact that we do have a work group coming together, that there is now some funding behind that work group, and that the focus on building a community around folks with peers and the fact that we're really taking a first serious investment into suicide loss survivor support is going to be huge.
Caleb, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, when we were looking for a way to solve or better address mental health challenges on Board of Regents campuses specifically, because that's where we started at. When I was talking to counseling center staff members and mental health experts here on campus, I was like, oh yeah, just hire more counselors. But then we have a workforce shortage, and I was like, well, we can't do that necessarily. And so we're talking about like the political feasibility of getting funding for some sort of mental health program. And when talking with members of the Board of Regents, I mean, it was made clear that we can't just employ people because there aren't people to be employed right now. Like we have that workforce shortage for mental health professionals. Erik hit the nail on the head when he talked about we just need more counselors. But that's not going to happen overnight, especially because it's more of like an ongoing fund situation. And so like a good segue into House Bill 1079, addressing prevention measures, building up communities, equipping youth and young adults with skills that they might not have through very effective programs that are ran by Lost and Found. That was something that it was a home run at that point. Obviously it's a step in the right direction. It's not going to, get it done right now. But when we were having those conversations with elected officials from across the state, we knew in our heart that it wasn't going to be enough to fully address the problem, but we knew that something had to be done. And being a part of that advocacy team and seeing the stories that came out from people who I didn't even solicit them to email legislators, but a legislator would come up to me and share this testimony of one of their constituents struggling with mental health. I mean, it is something that obviously impacts every community in South Dakota, specifically rural communities and tribal nations, like Erik said earlier. But when we talk about how can we address this with advocacy and efforts, we need to talk about it in a realistic perspective. That's the conversation Erik and I had from the start, and it worked well out in the end.
Well, thank you both for sharing a little bit about that and kind of hearing insights from a younger student, generational perspective, and someone who works in it and it's kind of been leading the charge for several years. It's nice to hear those stories come together. We've alluded to House Bill 1079 several times now in this podcast episode. And for our listeners and audience members, let's dive into that further. So what exactly is House Bill 1079? And what is your involvement in the passage of it?
So I'm glad that we have the old guy gets to introduce House Bill 1079. So House Bill 1079 was a one-time general appropriation bill that was put up in the South Dakota legislature in the 2023 legislative session that focused money towards three specific programs: peer support programs, campus or community mental health data collection, and suicide loss survivor support. The bill itself was designed to have an emergency clause, which meant that the funds would be available immediately. And it was designed to be a grant program run through the South Dakota Department of Health. The origin story of 1079 starts about a year and a half ago. Lost and Found, like many organizations in the state of South Dakota, were funded under various levels of federal funding made available through the CARES Act. And what Lost and Found was funded to do at the time through that funding was provide a peer-to-peer mentorship program on college campuses. When we knew that those funds were likely going to expire, we had a conversation with the Department of Health and our contacts there to say what opportunities exist to move this forward and sustain the program. Because what we could see in terms of impact was 100% of the students involved, mentor, mentee, were satisfied with the program, which is a great metric, but more importantly, over 90% of them were meeting their goals in the program, and over 80% were experiencing increases in resilience, which is, for in layman's terms, I guess, for the professional in the field, really building protective factors against suicide. Really critical stuff. And because we did not see any immediate continuation of that funding, and there was a lot of uncertainty around that, Lost and Found said, we're going to have to listen to what's happening at this moment and figure out where does continuation funding come from. House Bill 1079 was born out of that conversation, and inevitably conversations that were then had with the governor's office as well as with the then Secretary of Health. And in both cases, what came out of those conversations was we may need to see, or there's a lot of conversation about who's going to support this. Will the administration support it? And I think generally speaking, what's important and what's important now is that the governor did support it. The administration did support it. I think there was maybe some policy adjustments that needed to be thought through where, one nonprofit maybe shouldn't be the ones to receive all the funds from something. And I think that was maybe the misconception. We weren't going to receive all those funds, and we never planned to. It was a matter of figuring out how do we create something that we know is going to be effective. And so November, December of 2022, time flies, a few conversations happened. One was with the legislators in Lost and Found's home district in District 15. So we picked up probably one of our first key allies, which was Linda Duba. And then shortly thereafter, we spoke with who would eventually become the sponsors, Taylor Rayfelt, the Republican from District 14, the Assistant Majority Leader, and then Senator Sidney Davis from Burbank, good old Vermilion. And out of that process came the true, I guess, form of the legislative session. Make sure you have your stakeholders before you ever arrive, know who you're talking to, know your talking points. And then when January arrives, strap up, get ready to go. Prepare for some blizzards that are going to keep you in Pierre. And I think I won't speak entirely for Caleb in this case. I want to give him a chance to share his experience. That was my first experience in advocacy, not being a student, lobbying start to finish. And what that experience meant for us was I got humbled a lot. The experience of lobbying in Pierre is the most rewarding and painful experience you can ask for, because you are constantly going back the next day, change your talking points, you start over. The best advice I got was just keep repeating your words, because eventually they're just going to stick. And they did, but it didn't come without a lot of planned communication, clarification, answering questions, but then a lot of conversations that you would expect of the work that happens in the South Dakota legislature tends to happen beforehand and after hours when you're meeting with legislators and talking to folks. And so we did a really great job of getting our message out before session started, and knowing that our key contacts in the appropriations world, which is where the money is spent in the South Dakota legislature, knew enough about what was going on and the problem beforehand to walk into a session where they're getting inundated with requests day after day after day, to know that this actually had some promise. And so my experience was of every up and down possible, knowing that this was something that would very likely be the support that would sustain our organization long term, but also really sticking your neck out to fight for your ecosystem and fight for the other organizations who are doing the work with you. So with that, I'll turn over to the actual student advocate.
All the talking points are coming back to me right now. I'm just like sitting here talking. We're talking about all these different programs and talking to legislators, meeting them in the hallway and after. Early mornings and long nights. We'll say that. Good thing I like coffee. 1079 was my first real start to finish for lobbying in the South Dakota legislature. I was familiar with the process. I was familiar with the legislators. But when it came to like drafting the bill and introducing it and getting legislators' support on it and calling legislators at the most random hour when they're driving back from Pier to support it the next week and having hard conversations with individuals who thought that the problem of the mental health crisis facing us right now was too big to solve or too big to even address. There were a lot of disheartening conversations, I would say, but good thing they were outnumbered with really good conversations with legislators and elected officials about wanting to build that coalition to actually see results. My experience with it was I hated asking for money. I could not stand going up to legislators and asking for more money than I even will ever have in my name. But I think it was so rewarding in the sense that, Erik, yet again, correct. It was so rewarding in the sense that when I went up to those legislators, I knew that even though it might have been awkward at the time for me, I'm advocating for someone right now that doesn't even know they have a problem, that doesn't even know what could potentially be coming to them. And so even though it was awkward, it motivated me every morning because I could get up and I knew that I was on the right side of this issue, that we were doing the right thing when we're talking about House Bill 1079 and better addressing the problems and all the talking points that we repeated over and over again, and all the one-pagers that we printed out and sent out and put on the desks. I knew it was all worth it because of the people who didn't even know about. I mean, the people who are going to be affected by this probably are never going to know about House Bill 1079, but that's the beauty of the work that we did. That's the beauty of working with Erik, is that it's someone who loves an organization, is devoted to an organization and the cause, that is okay with not being rewarded with it. That was a humbling experience to be part of that coalition. Hope to do it again sometime. Hopefully not lobbying for asking for more money, though. It was a lot. These guys are way older than me, and they know a lot more about appropriations and the state budget. But put on a good face and act confident. You can get $2 million.
Cheers to that, because that's fake it till you make it, right?
I feel like that should have been our tagline and our one pager was just. No, there's a lot I think to say too of what Caleb and the Student Federation did to organize students who were showing up in hearings and coming to the Capitol and making sure they were inundating the inboxes, the call center, like everything that Caleb did really focused on what Lost and Found really started with, which was how do you get students to speak up and say, hey, you actually have power to change something. And yeah, if you want an embodiment of Lost and Found, that's what it's about.
It's almost like normalizing conversations and storytelling has an impact.
How interesting, Joel. Maybe that's the point of this campaign project. Sorry.
Oh, we love it. Well, so 1079 obviously is just one piece of the puzzle. It's one piece of the pie. And it, as far as solutions go, has the ability, the capacity to make a lot of change, and a lot of good things could come out of it. So as we consider further solutions, we know that through this project and through this podcast and through a lot of the work that we do just in general as advocates, is the goal of normalizing the conversation around suicide and mental illness. So I'm curious, Caleb, in your opinion, how has sharing your story or being an advocate for other people's story, or for those that don't know that they have a story to share yet, changed the way that you approach advocacy as a student?
Well, 100% humanize the issue. Obviously, this is a very human issue, but when I went up to legislators and told them my own story, many of them who have known me for years at the time, told them my story, my struggles with mental health, it took away maybe the potential for politics or dislike of a specific word or language in the policy. And it was more of a conversation about how are you doing, and that support that we talked about earlier. So instead of just talking about, this is the language of the bill, this is the funding we want, this is the impact of lives that we can change right now, I was embodying a program, peer-to-peer mentoring, and all the support that it offers through my conversations. And when we ended those conversations, I never was like, would you please support our bill? Because I couldn't bring myself to that. Usually it's pretty clear one way or another. But when I had those conversations, and at the end of it, I'd say, that support you offered me right there when I needed it most, and I opened up to you and told you my story, that's something that's missing in South Dakota communities right now. You name it, it's missing. A lot of them, I had stories from constituents about how they were struggling with mental health. And these people, they're good people for the most part. I like a lot of them. But when we had those conversations and all that support, I said, this is a program that's offered by one of the programs or one of the organizations that could potentially get this funding. That support you just offered me can help change my life. The support you could offer for this legislation could help change other people's life. And I would say, as a student leader, I knew I was paid by far the lowest for my lobbying efforts in the entire legislature. And so when I went up to them, I knew for a fact that they were taking me serious for my authentic words I was going to share with them, because they knew that I was going to gain nothing out of this other than the fact that it helped change lives. And the coalition, I want to talk about this for a second. I don't want to ramble on too long, but the coalition that my friends at the Student Federation built, because it was not all me by any means. They were probably annoyed at me by the end with how many emails I sent them. But the coalition that students built to come together, to email legislators, to apply pressure about this issue with 1079 and mental health, it was phenomenal. I had every single legislator by the end of session email me or call me or text me, reach out to me and say, when are you going to have these emails stop? Because I just got one and session's been over for 2 weeks about someone struggling with mental health and supporting House Bill 1079. So, well, you can always support a similar bill next year and maybe the year after, and then we can have the conversation about ongoing funds for mental health resources, which we could have another podcast about in of itself. But that is, episode 2. But that's something where, it's a lasting impact on legislators. I had many of them come up to me and ask, are you guys bringing something similar this year? How does the data look? What's going on? And that's some conversations that are obviously going to start more and more and more. But it's exciting to see, because the legislators, they didn't just vote in support of it, but they want to follow through and make sure that it has an impact, because it impacts every single one of their constituents.
That's really fascinating. I don't think I guess I knew that this happened, that follow-up conversations were being had, but I didn't realize the impact of that and how far it goes. That's really cool. Thank you. Erik, any final thoughts on that before we jump in a little bit further? Okay, cool. So I want to hear from both of your perspectives on this one. How does a digital storytelling project such as 30 Days, 30 Stories, like we're doing right now during this month, impact student prevention advocacy?
Well, not being a student, not anymore anyway. I think what the real intent of a project like this presents is real stories of how people actually got help. I don't know that we often tell the story of what's working per se. And when I say what's working, what I really mean is, Caleb and I can go up here and talk about statistics about what's bad right now in South Dakota all day long. We had whole sheets of this. One pagers. We have lots of those. What I think is really critical for us as a state and for mental health work around the country, frankly, is we need more stories of what happens when people actually get help and the success of getting help, because I don't know that we get enough of that. It's probably the biggest challenge I've ever faced in my role in the seat that I occupy now is the question, are you actually saving lives? And it's an interesting question. It's a good question of, okay, suicide rates have continued to go up in South Dakota. Yeah, we've been in existence for 13 years. That doesn't mean that we own the entire problem, first and foremost. But number two, we don't have enough data and understanding of what will actually prevent suicide. We talk about preventing and predicting whether somebody's actually going to die by suicide. You can't predict it. I mean, it's just not feasible. What we need to do, though, is we need better stories of actually what actually works for people. I think we see that in certain ways where implementing evidence-based practice is the fun scientific term for this, of like, we have that information in spades, but do we actually get to see somebody who looks like us, who has our experience, getting help and successfully living life, quote unquote, whatever success might mean? That's the stuff that's really powerful about this, I think. And I don't know what that means for a student who might tune in. I hope that there's enough view of that for them to see that there is hope for them because somebody else who is like them got help. That's really what I can only hope for at this point.
Yeah, I'd say earlier we were talking about how much information the younger generations have through social media and everything. The campaign digitally that is going on right now is phenomenal for the reach of students that it can get. I know students aren't the only demographic that you guys are seeking to help, but on campus, when we talk about student organizations reaching more people, it's through social media. It's through stories about this organization helped me do this and that. Lost and Found launching this initiative, it's powerful because it reaches people where they're at. It doesn't make them have a conversation in person, which some might not be able to do yet. But us being able to openly talk about not only our own mental health issues, but what we did to help address the problem that's going on right now, hopefully it helps individuals understand that, you can be student body president, you can still be depressed. You can still have anxiety. You're not going to be perfect. Trust me. As a retired student body president, I sponsor this message. But at the end of the day, using social media is the best thing that Lost and Found can do with this, and I'm very happy to see it. And I've been following along, and I will continue to follow along.
Well, thanks. So how can organizations like Lost and Found collaborate with other entities like campuses and student programming and like the Student Federation and the Board of Regents, etc., to create a more effective system for support for students?
Yeah, I don't want to go in and talk about GAF funding or HEF funding and all these different mechanisms
No one knows
of
what
how
that
we
means,
exactly.
Caleb.
It's all this pointless, well, not pointless, but it's all this niche information that I'll never need again in my life, but I know it, so it's kind of nice.
Until you come back and lobby.
Exactly, until I come back and I lobby again. But what's important is to understand that the biggest hurdle, if you will, in quotations around biggest hurdle, is funding to address this problem. You can get all the private donations you want, but nothing's going to give you enough motivation or enough support behind you if it's not the government helping you out to a certain degree. I don't want to go talk about the role of the government right now, but I think there's a certain role of the government from a humanities standpoint that if this is the number one cause of death and it's preventative, well, I think we should look into that. That's kind of neat to be able to help solve that. But when it comes to the Board of Regents, when it comes to Student Federation, when it comes to all these things, a conversation needs to be had about where are there, and the regents I know are not going to appreciate this comment, but where are there gaps in funding, where are there opportunities for funding to pull from one and go towards mental health initiatives on campus. My other thing would be directed a little bit away from Board of Regents institutions and higher education. It's K-12. What can we do more? And these were so many conversations we had. We talked about how you have physical health that's preventative. Why not mental health that's preventative? The amount of times I said that in peer should be illegal. But what's important to understand at the end of the day is that the people who are in South Dakota K-12, the system right now, going to elementary, middle, and high school, they're going to come to USD, SDSU, whatever. Maybe they don't even like South Dakota, so they're going to leave us. That's a bad move. If you're listening, come to USD. But I think what's more important to understand, though, is that we need to meet them where they're at and get them equipped with the skills and with the support systems so that when they have something happen, either to them or a loved one, they can be able to be resilient enough to make it through that. That's something where I think House Bill 1079 was the strongest, that we didn't just pick the Board of Regents or the Board of Tech Ed. We said, no, we're going to help the current generation. We're going to help future generations of coyotes, of jackrabbits, of whatever they want to be. We want to help them where they're at. And so that's something where, as a student advocate, I felt most proud to be a part of the team, because we could address them no matter when, no matter where. I think those conversations are going to be harder to have when the funding gets a little bit more tight, but nothing good pressure can't help with.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for those thoughts. Erik, we've just got one last question for you. So what do you believe that the future holds for Lost and Found and for student advocacy in South Dakota?
Dun, dun, dun. Put me on the spot. What is going to happen with Lost and Found? I think what I'm most excited about right now is that we have stability in the sense that our programs are going to continue on. We received a notice of award from the Department of Health, and we're preparing for what that looks like. And I know that what's great about that is ultimately that means that the results of 1079 were successful for not just us, but there are other organizations who will benefit from those funds and be able to, I should say, not just the organizations benefiting, there are people who are going to benefit from those programs. And I think it's really important to have that distinction. So Lost and Found will continue to provide peer mentorship programs for the entire Board of Regents system. We'll be able to have access for Board of Technical Ed students as well. Any private institution, hopefully in the future, will be able to serve tribal nations as well. But I think really what it means, what the future holds for Lost and Found right now is we just set up a pattern for the next 4 to 5 years where folks are going to know that they have access to peer support. Folks are going to know that they can call us for support for suicide loss survivors. And we're going to have better data to look at. And that's something that's, Caleb alluded to, ongoing funding. I would hope that there will be ongoing funding for this type of work. But I think what's interesting too is Lost and Found knows that we're part of an ecosystem that ultimately works closely with state government, that works with a wide variety of partners. And I know that in the next 2 years, the current state suicide prevention plan is going to turn over. So what I hope the future holds for Lost and Found is that there will still be that direct connection to student advocacy. See what we did there? That will elevate Lost and Found's relevance in the sense that we're not just an organization serving communities with more programming, or that we're just another thing to look forward to in the mental health ecosystem, but that we actually do effectively channel voices of students, that we're actually channeling real stories and real experiences, I guess, for lack of a better word, from students who are using our programs and know that they have an impact in their life, and they're demonstrating that. It's not we're not just pulling data out of thin air when students are saying, this is what kept me in school. This is what gave me a better, I guess, prospect of what my relationships would look like. I'm connecting with new friends. Those are things that actually have real impact in ways that we may not always fully value in this conversation of suicide, exactly, or see. But I think for student advocacy, I see a future in which there is going to be a day when that funding does come to an end. We bought ourselves time, in a sense, and not just Lost and Found, but for the ecosystem in general. That is going to translate into what happened, what worked, what didn't, what do we do next, and ultimately the folks who are going to have to carry that message, especially when it comes to setting up funding sources or good, God forbid you're talking about GAF funding, things that no one wants to talk about, but it's important, is students deciding how do they want their general activity fees assessed and brought out for services that are going to help them. And so I think the next stage of student advocacy in South Dakota for this is going to come back to the stories of peer mentors, the stories of students also who decide this is a permanent thing that we want to change, and we want to take the next step in building a more permanent ecosystem in South Dakota. And that's what I'm excited to see what the next story is. I don't know what that will be. Students are going to have to decide that.
Well, Caleb, let's end with you sharing your thoughts on the future of student advocacy in the state of South Dakota.
Yeah, I think Lost and Found should be hearing from the Federation here pretty soon, even though I'm retired from that as well. They're not giving up on this topic yet, and I'm very happy for that. I think student advocacy after this last year, uh, when I ran for student body president, everyone's just talking about, oh, mental health this, mental health that. This is an entire campaign we're going to run on. And then nothing happened. They got elected saying that they're going to change the world, and then nothing happened. And students were tired on it. And when I ran, I was like, I'm not going to promise anything, but I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to try. I think that attitude resonates with students, not just because we were successful, but you might as well just give it a shot. You might as well try. I think student advocacy after this last year understood that that's a good attitude to have, and that, like Erik said so many times, students have the power to change what's going on with them and what's affecting them and the policies that are written that way. If they organize in a respectful manner, if they're realistic about the outcome that they want to see, they can do it. They just need to build a coalition that's broad, that's diverse, and that's effective, and they're going to be able to get the job done.
Incredible answer. Well, thank you both so much for being here. Before we wrap up, let's just end with one final question, and it doesn't have to be related to mental health. But I'm curious, what is one thing that you've learned in your young lives? See what I did here? I'm calling you young.
Thank you, Joel.
That you wish that everyone else knew. Specifically about storytelling, because that is really the point of this project. So if there was something that you could tell the world about storytelling, what would it be?
Yeah, I think sure. Okay, go first. If you're authentic, people are going to take you. They're going to consider you as a friend rather than a lobbyist or a student or student body president. They're going to want to have a conversation with you about that, and not just mental health, but overall, just being authentic to who you are and the stories you have, and sharing them. You don't know what it can do, but the power that stories have to change lives, it's immense. It's proven. It's common sense, in my opinion. But if you're authentic in your approach to those stories, if you're authentic to who you are, it's going to make life a lot easier. And people want to hear your stories when you're authentic. They want to hear your stories when it's your truth and when it's who you are. And I mean, you're gonna have some pretty cool stories as well. But I think storytelling when you're authentic is the best way to go about it.
I think maybe it's just related to public speaking that I've now grown to appreciate this. If you give people a chance to actually answer your question, they're probably going to answer it. Sounds really basic, but I can't tell you how many times I've been in a room where we're speaking and somebody will ask a question and they're waiting to answer the question, but they keep going forward. I think I've had to learn that lesson now so many times where I'm very fast to the draw and I just want to get through it. You let your kind of anxiety drive your conversation a little bit too quickly. And now I've learned to just kind of sit in the silence, which can be painful, very painful. But I think it's important for us to give people a chance to actually answer a question.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for the wisdom, the insight, the conversation today. I really appreciate it. Thank you, audience, for being here. We really appreciate you coming out on a random Monday evening to hang out with us. So really, really appreciate it. I want to take this time to throw it out to the audience to see if there's any questions or anything we can answer for you. Yeah, so the question from one of our audience members was about the support that we provide for suicide loss survivors and what that is and what that looks like.
So glad you asked the question. And what that looks like for Lost and Found specifically is Lost and Found operates what's called the Survivors Joining for Hope program. And that program was brought to us by another nonprofit in Sioux Falls who started it after a man in Sioux Falls lost his brother who was in the military and decided he was so moved by what the military had installed, which was called the Casualty Assistance Officer Program, where they basically followed the family for the better part of a year, providing resources in the wake of a loss. And he had realized there wasn't anything available in the private sector to actually deal with this. So he created a nonprofit that provided financial assistance to suicide loss survivor families. And he being Brad Hurst, who's now a board member for Lost and Found and a dear friend, decided about a year and a half ago that it was time for him to give up the nonprofit. He didn't have the people power, I guess, to keep that going, but he had the resources to do it, or the funding to continue. And so what that program has become was, the second that it was brought into Lost and Found, Lost and Found has what's called a community health worker that's operated certification program through the Department of Health, where we have somebody who's providing kind of social work-like services to suicide loss survivor families on a one-on-one basis. And there are checkpoints that we take on for the better part of a year. And the wraparound for that resource is connect you to support groups, connect you to financial resources, connect you to community-based resources, programs that may be helpful, but then also really just provide a lot of advising and support. Things like, I know our CHW, who oversees the program, has had to go down the path of helping them navigate through health insurance questions, or dealing with medical debts, or dealing with other things that you and I might not think of, but when we're talking about actually helping somebody who has died, or their family who's been left behind, you go through the simultaneous process of what is it like to help somebody in grief. And then, as we found with the program, which we didn't know going into this, was that it actually serves over 95% low to moderate income families. And almost all those families experience a financial crisis of some kind because of the loss. And so Lost and Found is the only provider of that type of program in South Dakota, and it might be the only program like it in the country, which is kind of a unique thing to navigate. But otherwise in South Dakota, what it looks like in terms of suicide loss survivor support is the primary partner in the field, which is the Helpline Center, has been providing a suicide loss survivor support group for probably the better part of it's been a long time. I don't know exactly how much, so I won't speak to it. But what's cool, I guess, next, and ask the question of what the future holds for Lost and Found. Lost and Found also recently created a campus postvention guide that takes all of the known information on how to respond to a suicide loss and put it into an actual readable format, which I don't mean to be crass. But there's a lot of guides out there that are 35, 40 pages long that when you're a dean of students and dealing with a suicide death, kind of hard to read through. So we engage campuses in going through kind of the 5-point plan of how do you respond. And hopefully in the new year ahead, knowing that this has been a priority of the state of South Dakota, that we'll actually be able to implement loss plans at every campus. So lots of things to say about suicide loss survivor support, but that's where Lost and Found, I guess, fits into the picture. Good question.
Thank you so much for that. Any other questions? All right, seeing none, we'll wrap up here. Just wanted to say once again, thank you to the University of South Dakota for letting us use their space this evening. Thank you, Caleb, for joining us on a Monday evening and taking some time away to have another conversation with us, because it seems like all we do is talk. It's great. And Erik, thank you again so much for not only leading the way for us and being, part of this incredible organization that's doing this work, but for taking the time out to have a conversation with other students. So yeah, thank you so much. Listeners, if you are tuning in or engaging with us in the audience, if you would like to see the rest of our 30 Days, 30 Stories project, you can go to 30stories.org. That is the number 30, so 30stories.org. You can also check us out on our webpage, that's resilienttoday.org, and on all social media channels at Resilient Today. And until next time, the next episode that we air, stay well. Thanks so much for listening. Remember to subscribe, rate, and review Great Minds wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more information about Lost and Found, go to resilienttoday.org. That's ResilientToday.org. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Resilient Today. Until next time, do more and stay well.